audible and visible? Okay, thank you. So assuming that is the case, my speech will start in 3, 2, and 1. To debate on the grounds of national security, we must first look deeper and ask what created such a construct in the first place. Because by definition, it is the highest moral obligation of a state to protect its people. We cannot allow the interests of the state and people to become separate, lest we forget the very reason national security was conceptualized in the first place. Very proud to oppose. 3 things in today's speech. Firstly, very briefly on the opposition's stance and some brief response to the first proposition speaker. Secondly, a bit of reframing we think they missed out on. And finally, 2 arguments. Firstly, on why individual rights are absolutely inalienable in principle. And secondly, why allowing the state to take precedent over the rights of the people is very harmful in nature. Very simply, opposition stance is that individual rights are always the priority over national security. And now on to a bit of brief response. First proposition comes up and tells you that on a principle, it is the moral obligation of countries to protect their people. Surely if this is true, and if national security derives its principalness from the rights of the people, you need to cater to the rights of the people over national security if they themselves concede that national security as a concept is derived from individual rights. But secondly, no, they don't. You pay taxes, and they say that taxes are sufficient moral grounds upon which to infringe upon people's rights and upon which to determine which people's rights should be protected. However, so do the minorities that you are infringing upon. Everyone in a state pays taxes, and moreover, rights do not come from whether or not you are able to pay monetary funds to the state. Rights are inalienable in nature because they deserve to be afforded to humans, and that is something that you cannot strip from people. More on this in the second argument. But secondly, I'd just like to flag out to you that they only engage on developed countries. Panel, this should immediately be a gigantic red flag to you because there are 2 reasons why developing countries are far more important than already developed countries, and proposition fail to engage upon these. The first reason of which is that developing countries comprise the majority of the world, but secondly, developing countries are the most vulnerable actors. The moment at which they assume that all states are financially stable and stability is a given is the moment at which they refuse to engage in the characterizations where people need most to be protected and individual rights need to be protected the most. So secondly then, on some reframing, we think firstly, national security, as side proposition concedes, draws its importance from individual rights. Therefore, the state derives power from over people for the reason that it is obligated to protect its citizens. But secondly, the characterization of national threat I'd like to flag out to you is quite narrow in proposition world. For example, they talk about crime fighting and they only talk about the very extreme examples, such as terrorism. But I'd like to note that, for example, surely in authoritarian countries, crime rate is far, far lower, yet we still agree unanimously that in those places, the human rights violations are far higher. That is a trade-off that we are unwilling to make on side opposition. So then the first argument, why individual rights are absolutely inalienable in principle, no matter what. 1, I'd just like to draw attention to the fact that they are indeed called rights. They are a basic moral standard of what should be afforded to anyone, and the state absolutely cannot have the power to define who is a human and who deserves these basic rights. Because if weighing national security is against individual rights, then surely there is some level of infringing on the people's ability to consent to this. And because they have no say in the matter, this in and of itself is already infringement. But on a second level, I'd just like to ask where these human rights come from and why they're so inalienable. The answer to this is that people have basic human dignity as a sentient member of society, and that is what entitles us to these rights, and that is why they are also inalienable. Our humanity is something that cannot be stripped from us. As such, the state does not have power to defend and define the parameters of who is deserving of these basic rights, because surely every member of society is a human. Regardless of how egregious a crime someone has committed, they are still human regardless of what opinions they harbor and where they come from. Our humanity is something that absolutely cannot be stripped away. But secondly, the rights that entail cannot and never should be either. No thank you. So then the second argument then, why allowing the state to take precedence over the rights of the people is harmful in practice. Proposition is very picky with the examples they use. They talk about how people's safety is not going to be compromised on their side, and that states don't do principled, practical things for principled reasons. But I think a clear example that undermines this premise is that, for example, if security cameras were placed in every corner of the world, obviously the Earth would be a lot safer. But the government cannot and can never do that, even if it would increase safety for the reason that it infringes on our rights to privacy. For the same reasons, the national interests are usually defined by those in power who are privileged. Therefore, I think there are three reasons why it's going to be harmful to give them the power to take precedence over individual rights. Firstly, they are unlikely to be considerate. People in power are very insulated from the impacts on the ground. Therefore, it is not only hard to empathize, but also hard to feel the harms on the ground. They have no interest to engage with these people the moment at which the concept of individual rights does not weigh over their interests. But secondly, you give them the license to infringe on the most vulnerable, and in giving the state these choices, you give them a very dangerous amount of power to harm minority groups that have no say in the concept of national security. On our side, the state is at least kept in check by this concept of an inalienable human right, regardless of who you are and how powerful you are. We debate here on a controversial topic because it is our basic human entitlement to speak, think, and live. Remember this and know that this mobility is arbitrarily threatened on the proposition.